Jerry is an advisor with the Soil Association, mainly arable and soil, but I think you end up going to a lot of different farms as well, Jerry. So look, great to have you here. You have a lot of experience as a farmer as well, so we'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you very much. I hope I live up to my billing. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk and to explain really what this innovative farmers model, the way that we in the UK support farmer-to-farmer research, trying to move that research away from that top-down attitude of we made a product, we want you to buy it, isn't it wonderful, to what will work on your farm. If it doesn't work on your farm, why doesn't it work on your farm? Maybe you should tweak it this way. So the way we try to work is this. So just a little bit of background. You may be aware of the Soil Association as a certification body that certifies all the probably half of the licensees in organic in the UK. That covers farming and horticulture. It also covers food and drink. It covers forestry, and equally, amazingly, we also do beauty and well-being and fashion and textiles. So we do cover an awful wide range of products. But there's another side to the Soil Association, which is the charity, which is funded, and objective is to support people towards healthy soil, healthy food, and a healthy climate. And so we work in that sort of space. We have a business development side. We have an amazing charity called Food for Life. And for people now looking particularly at the cost of living crisis and concerns about food for children at schools and hospitals, it's an amazing charity work that they do supporting fresh food into those sort of environments. And the farming and land use team, that's the one that I work for. Specifically, I work in the producer support team. My job is to advise people who are looking at organic farming systems. But we have two other projects, Soil Association Exchange, which is a new project we're working on, and Innovative Farmers. And Innovative Farmers is what we're going to be talking about here today. And Innovative Farmers was set up initially with support from Waitrose, Future Farming Project, in order to support this farmer-to-farmer research, which is what Sean was mentioning just now. It's actually been running for 10 years. So we've celebrated our 10 years earlier on this year. We actually had Prince Charles, who's now King Charles, attended an open day at Errand Farm when we talked about some of the successes and the way it's moving forward. And really what we want to do is, in that we have engaged, we reckon, more than 12,000 farmers, all working together to share knowledge. That working together involves everything from running trials to attending events, even WhatsApp groups as part of the projects that we're working on. We've used 453,000 funding is now wrong. We're over £500,000 of funding has been moved into farming research at a ground level. And we have run over 120 different field labs in that 10-year period of time. We'll talk about the basis of the field labs in a second. As I said, we are funded. One of the key points with all these projects is how you get funded. We are funded from the Prince of Wales Charitable Fund, Dutchy Original, so if you ever go to a Waitrose shop and buy some Dutchy biscuits, you'll be funding our project, and the Soil Association. And we also work with a range of other people who will support us in various ways. For example, Organic Arable, grain marketing co-op in the UK. Cotswold Seeds, I know everybody in Ireland is well aware of because of their supply chains. Also ADAS, a research organisation, AHDB. Anglia Water, the water companies, are very keen on some of the work we do, and we will use their funding to support us. Not to get the answers they want, to get the farmers to be moving in the directions we want them to go. The funding streams for the projects we set up are based around roughly £10,000 per trial. There's not a lot of big bucks goes into these projects. They are very small scale. And that is money that we use to fund the testing a farmer wouldn't do normally. In some cases, it's actually buying machinery or equipment or paying for contractors the farmer themselves wouldn't normally do, but wants to take on board as part of this project. And we don't pay the farmer for their involvement in these projects. They're all volunteers. They carry the risk, but they get all the reward for doing it. Where if we ask them to come and speak at an event, we will fund them for that. And if they have farm visits, we will pay for catering and food and pay them for that time. Because if someone comes on, you have a group of farmers coming to your farm, it's absolutely right that you should be recompensed for your time. Farmers are too often given our time free to organisations who are making money out of the whole system. Farmers need to be paid for their time in some way. What we do is we set up what we call field labs. And the field lab is literally that, a lab in a field. We use the on-farm research and trials grant. We provide a dedicated support from a coordinator. I coordinate about 4 or 5 trials at the moment. These coordinators' job is to be that nag in the background that rings up and says, have you taken those soil samples? Mr. Researcher, where are the results you promised me yesterday? I need them now because I've got to get the information out. We fund the researcher to come and do the work because whatever we try and do, you need to have some sort of scientific rigor to all of these trials. Otherwise, it becomes no different to a farmer just trying a different variety in a field and deciding whether it works better, because we need to get some sort of things. And all the trials that we set up are set up by a researcher, but the researcher is responsible and basically answers to the farmer. He doesn't answer to his research organisation or the head of the department or the long-term strategy he himself has. He's doing the work for the farmer. The other thing we do a lot of is dissemination of information. So we have events and field lab visits. We have on-farm visits. We have farmers walking around talking to each other. And one of the big things that comes out of the field lab is not necessarily that the trial demonstrates that this result is 10% better. Sometimes it's 2 farmers saying, well, you've got clay soil, you've got a sandy soil. I'd have used these mixtures on your place. I wouldn't have used these ones. Or coming into the farm in the trial and saying, why did you use that particular drill? Or why did you use that sort of concept? So it's very much about communication and learning from each other in an open, I'm not right, you're not wrong, maybe there's a way we can work together and come up to a conclusion that works for everybody's benefit. And what we also do is use press and media as much as possible to get all the information out to the farming community because, and the phrase I used earlier on today, and one farmer said, for all farmers, one of the farmers is quoted as saying, it's really nice with these trials to know I'm not the only idiot out there trying things, because you're feeling support within a group of farmers doing the same thing. And what we do when we select our trials, what we do, the way it works, a farmer or a group of farmers will come to us and say, I'd like to research this question. And the reason the projects that we look at, we will look at ideas from farmers with a clear benefit to everybody else. So I'm not going to research a little project that only valid for that one little farm. We want to move practices which move farming away from, and I've written in input-based systems here, but mainly to challenge back to that thing that we've been led from above by told that we use more inputs to get more productivity. We only use ideas which are, I say, not based in farming or horticulture. We don't work outside of that space. And we will run field labs as part of a larger funded projects such as Horizon 2020s. Now, the reason I'm actually here initially comes back to some field labs we ran as part of a project called Okena EcoFeed, which was looking at alternatives to pigs and poultry. And my project was looking at what happens if you heat treat beans. Small field lab, just run as very small scale as part of a bigger European project. But it's the sort of project we can run because it brings the farmers and groups of farmers into those projects which tend to have a very high research, tend to have a very high academic aspect, but not necessarily a very high farming input. So we try to bring the farmers into those projects. What we do not do is look at existing or previously researched topics unless there's something different happening. Okay. We don't research commercially available or new commercial products. If you've just invented a new chemical, it's your job to prove it works. It's not our job to prove it works. Okay? We don't work on those investment ideas which a farmer has to invest a huge amount of money for, because if it doesn't work, he's wasted his money on something. We work on a much smaller scale. We don't do comparisons between products. So interesting that you had David Johnson speaking yesterday, the Johnson-Su biodigester. One of the questions we often get asked, and I'm preempting a question that might come later, will you test that? Why? Because we know it works, and the only way we could probably test that system is compare against something like bokashi as an alternative composting product. But what are we going to prove by putting one against the other? We have 2 different ways of producing good compost. Let's let them both people choose the one that works best for them. So we're not about being competitive, we're about moving farmers forward. And we don't do trials which are not based in the field or on a farm, because it is all about farmer work. Okay. Not as complicated. We'll talk through what happens to develop a field lab and how it works. So right at the very top of the period, the idea and engagement. You, as a group of farmers, come to us and say, or as an individual farmer, I want to research this project. And we'll look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. I think we can do that. What is the question you actually want answered? Okay? So let's go back to that Johnson Sue question. If you came and said, should we research that one? What question do you actually want us to answer? Does Johnson Sue work? Well, yeah, we know it works. So that's not actually a trial. There may be subtle nuances we can do. Ones we come up, and I'll show you some examples of field labs we have done, where because you had a specific question, it became easy to answer it. And it's important we keep that question in mind all the way through on field labs. We then go and find a researcher who has an interest in the area. And these could be university researchers, it could be independent researchers, to formulate a clear research question, and then they will co-design the trial. So the trial, when we set it up, will have been set up and designed by a researcher. And what we are essential for all trials we do is there is a control area, one that hasn't got the treatment. Replication where possible on the farm, but also we do have replication on different farms. So for example, one of the trials we were involved with on organic wheat varieties, farmers in 5 different areas grew 3 different wheat varieties in their fields, and we used those as the replicates because that gave us a much broader idea of the way the farming works. It doesn't work in an academic sense, but it does work on an on-farm basis. We then, if we're comfortable with that, we then we have a steering committee who coordinates all of this. So there is a group of researchers, academics sat in the background who say, yeah, that's a project that's worthy, and the plan design is something that works, we're comfortable with it, it's going to bring out some information that is useful, and they will tweak the design if necessary, and we'll keep coming back into that. We then start the field lab by usually at that point having a startup meeting where any farmer who is interested in being part of the group will come along and have it explained to them, talk through, and we'll try and persuade them to put a little bit of their field aside for that project. We work on anything from a half field side to a whole field to a tramline width, so maybe only one tramline within your field has got the treatment. The rest of the field you carry on and do everything else you want to do. We do go down as far as small plot trials occasionally, but rarely. We run the field lab for as long as it takes. Normally we took 2 to 3 years for each field lab, so probably a couple of farming cycles. We've got one that's a 30-year project, which is on agroforestry, which is down in Devon. Simply because you cannot set up an agroforestry trial for 2 years. You know, there's nothing going to happen for 2 or 3 years. So we are looking at longer scale. But we try to keep them relatively short term because farmers can lose interest. You know, we want results. We don't want to keep on going out and retesting the same thing. We analyze the reports, report through any media we can, and then we share the results in any way we can. And the next steps could either mean there's a question that's developed out of that project. What do we want to do with it? Can we set up a second field lab working on the same sort of question, or that subtle difference? One example of the next steps, again in the UK, we ran the organic wheat variety trial for 3 years. Came to the end of the time and it felt it wasn't worth us continuing with it because we got some good results, but there weren't any new organic wheat varieties. But it then got picked up by DEFRA to rerun as something called live wheat, which is now a much bigger trial running on small numbers of varieties, looking at the way they work. So it's become a bigger trial, which we're no longer involved with, which is fine because our job was as a starter. One other important aspect, I'm glad we got a journalist chairing this one because getting the information into the farming press, into people's knowledge is something that's massively important. So UK-based slide. So Countryfile is the BBC's flagship countryside programme on a Sunday evening, the one that no farmer ever watches because it's nothing to do with farming, it's all about the countryside. Local radio. The guy being spoken to in the interview there was at the meeting. We just grabbed him and said, can you come and talk to the press? Turned out to be a brilliant speaker in that case, would not be very comfortable standing up here talking, but was great on radio. He's got a perfect face for radio. Field lab journals. Got a few copies of this one left. We produce them every year just to highlight some of the successes of some of the trials that have finished. I've got a few lying around, so help yourself, and some older ones, because I'm trying to get rid of them, because you can recycle them rather than I can. We also get articles. Poultry World is a very, very niche magazine that's brought out as part of the Farmers Weekly, and we had the whole article from the Connect feed on that. Bottom corner, groundswell. We speak at events like Groundswell, Oxford Real Farming Conference, wherever we get the opportunity to be invited to. And part of what our activities at something like Groundswell is that's where we ask for farmers to say, what do you want to do work on? Because it's one way of we can get those information from people who are feeling inspired to ask a question, and we try and catch them when they're in that inspired place. So I'm just going to just now chat through a few of the trials that we've run. I think it's 4 or 5 here, just to give you an example, and because of the fact that Sean's specifically wanting to look at the potential of using this model here in Ireland, what I'm picking up is some of the things that maybe we should have done differently as well, just to try sort of to help move the process, rather than just saying, we did this trial, aren't we brilliant? We did this trial, maybe we should have done this. Maybe there's another step going from this. This trial's just finished this year. The relevance to this within an arable-based thing is because the role that red clover can have within an arable rotation. Free source of fertility, really good for rooting and soil structure improvement. But the question has been, based on some research done 40 years ago in Australia, that you don't feed red clover to use at tupping time because they don't ovulate. Well, is that true? Because there's an awful lot of red clover being used in lays in the UK and in Ireland, and maybe the evidence is wrong. Turns out the trial was based on 100% red clover lay, not on a mixed lay. So what we did, very simple trial design, had half a dozen farmers who split their flocks into 2. The researcher on this was one of the farmers. He worked for ADAS, the research organisation, so it was our own flock involved in this as well. Split the flock into 2. One grazed one sward, one grazed the other. What we found is that we got higher scanning percentage on the lays with red clover, probably because the ewes were actually in much better health. And the lamb survival as well was higher. So they actually got more. Now, from the farming community point of view, in the UK we had an environmental scheme called Countryside Stewardship, mid-tier scheme, and one of the options, GS4, pays £370 a hectare for growing a high herbal rich sward in the mix. But sheep farmers are not going to grow it if they think their ewes are not going to have lambs if they're grazing it. So we've managed to make sure that these options are available and taking the confidence away, adding confidence to the farmers to feel that they can actually do something useful and use these resources. What we are aware of, there is further work needed on this, because we have to make sure that from a sheep health point of view, we're perfectly healthy. And this is one of those questions we're handing over to better qualified researchers to look at that next question. The infamous no-till with living mulches. This trial was set up by one of the most vocal regen farmers in England, the one that argues with everybody. Though I'm not going to mention him, everyone probably, if you're following the Farmers Forum, you know who I'm talking about. It was his idea. He rang me and said, can we do this? Because I'm convinced that we've got to find a way of cutting down our nitrogen use on the farm. I think clovers might be the solution, but I don't want to have livestock on the farm because I'm a regen farmer who hasn't got livestock. I don't know how that works, but anyway, he is. We set up this trial. We had 10 sites initially. We now have a group of 37 in a WhatsApp group who talk to each other about what's going right and wrong. We've run farm walks. We've just finished the 3rd year of the trial. Results-wise, hasn't been outstanding. The first thing that happened is most of the non-organic farms couldn't actually get clover to grow on their fields. The particular farmer I mentioned is one who failed miserably, and every year and every time he's tried, he just couldn't get the clover to grow. But we have had some interesting results from an organic farm who's done it. We know we can get up to 200 kilos of nitrogen available in the soil. Can we get it into the plant? That's the question. We know we're getting reduced yields. Part of that is because the organic farm pictured there, he's gone from a plough-based system to a no-till based system, and we know that if you just do that as an instant change, soil has the opportunity to catch up. We know there's a potential yield lag in the first instance. We've worked out that basically as long as we get less than a 15% yield loss, it's economically viable for farmers to do it because they don't have to do cover crops, they don't have to reseed every year, they don't have to terminate because you can terminate with a flock of sheep. We're now setting up a trial this year looking at an inter-row mower to mow the clover between the cereal crops so that we can damage the clover, make it release its nitrogen and stop the competition, even though we're using very, very low growing clovers. We know we're getting some competition. Within the trial basis, one of the problems we've actually had is the coordinator, who was from HDB, kept on changing. So we didn't have a continuity of nagging, and it was always based on sort of handover notes and stuff. So the trial itself has gone a bit stagnant and slowing down. But what's happened as a result of this trial is the fact you've all heard about it, there were nods around and ironic laughs. It's suddenly become a mainstream conversation because we stood up and set up this trial and challenged. And walking around at Groundswell last year, got up to an event, standing by a tent, and someone said, oh yeah, we had a crop failure, so we threw some clover in to try a no-till trial. And the guy I was walking around with looked and said, you've achieved everything your trial could ever get. You've made this concept mainstream. Part of the idea of this farmer farm, just get everybody thinking about it. Another interesting one, bearing in mind that the couple of the speakers you've had in the last 2 or 3 days, compost teas in arable. We did this some time ago. The whole idea to identify a best practice of using compost tea to try and reduce either inputs or to increase yield. As a question that a lot of people are asking, and here is an example of a trial that didn't go particularly well for a couple of reasons, which is why I wanted to highlight it. We didn't really find any results. We didn't get a great deal of change in the soil microbiology. One of the problems we discovered is that the farmer involved was very, very uncomfortable with the amount of water that was needed to wash out the sprayer every time they wanted to apply it, because it was applying conventional fungicides and she wasn't prepared to let them come on the farm. And so they were washing out the sprayer and then the sprayer operator was washing it again. Other things that happened, and this is the lesson to learn from this trial, after 2 years of using a proprietary compost product, the farmer decided she wanted to make her own. So suddenly we had a different product going in. So from a trial point of view, it was getting a bit iffy. But the other problem, we had the researchers started to try and take over. And they started to try and bend the trial in their direction. They suddenly started spending a lot of money on biology assessments. And they weren't less so interested in the yield responses. And they were trying to add different mixtures into the thing. So they took over a bit, and we didn't sort of, at the time, control them enough. It's one of the lessons we learned. The farmer should be in control, not the researcher. A livestock one that's really interesting. Again, a similar sort of outcome in the end. For all livestock farmers, dairy farmers, is not every mastitis case needs to be treated with an antibiotic. There are tests available. So we tested the tests to see whether they worked. And we found that you could actually reduce antibiotic use by 35% by using this testing method. The problem was the researcher, he was a vet, but very academic. And he wanted to have 150 trial results. And he's not going to publish his results until he's got the right number. And so it's frustrating because we've got results which are conclusive, but he's not willing to release it. So again, we need to manage that situation. That was also influenced by COVID. And then back into the arable context, glyphosate alternatives for cover crop destruction. One point I haven't made yet through this NFT Farmers is not about being organic or conventional. This is about all farming systems. And in this trial, what we looked at is crimper rolling, disking, sheep grazing, to see what effect that had on the control of cover crops in a no-till situation. Okay, so we were using summer sown cover crops for a spring sown crop. Okay, and what we were looking at is termination success, cash crop establishment, the cover crop establishment, and crop margins. And what we found is that all of those systems, crimper rollers, discs, flails, and those who've seen pictures on Twitter and whatever, Cambridge roller in the frost. Rolling on the frost kills annual cover crops. And there's some brilliant pictures where he swung round and left that little rounded triangle at the end of each row, which is green, and everything has died. If you want to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning when you have a frost to go and roll your cover crops. So there is maybe a degree of imperfection in the system, but we know that these are options. And in the case of this, one of the farmers involved has cut his glyphosate use by 50% for spring cropping, simply because he knows he can go out and roll it with the Cambridge rollers, and only uses glyphosate pre-drilling. He doesn't have to kill off the cover crop and then kill off the weeds that grow after the cover crop. Now, one problem here we had, very early stages of the program as well, but what we did is that sometimes, because of the researcher requirements, it all had to be rolled in December when there was a frost, and they weren't drilling until March. We were sometimes rolling the cover crops too early. And so we weren't necessarily taking what the farmer would have done. We were saying what the researcher would like to have done. So again, we tweak the way we look at these trials now. It's farmer-led. The farmer does what he wants to on his farm within the system, as long as it keeps broadly within the protocols of the trial we're setting up. And then finally, tips for a successful field lab. Keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate your trial. Make it very, very straightforward. What you can do, if you want to make it complicated, do tram lines in this direction with one treatment and work across the tram lines with another treatment. You double up your trials. Okay, but you're still working within the same broad, simple processes. We have found that if you ask farmers to collect too much data, it doesn't happen. They are quite busy. You know, and the one thing they're not particularly interested in is going out and looking at plant diversity in a herbal lay field when it's pouring with rain and they've just got the cows in. Some of them are really engaged and want to, but if we're expecting that results, we need the researchers to pull their weight on this. So we make sure what we're trying to collect is straightforward. Yields are really easy to collect, combine yields. We will use yield monitors off combines as our yield results because we know that's consistent. Agree realistic expectations from the trial. We are not going to change agriculture by running a living mulches trial. We are going to change the way people look at cover crops and termination of cover crops and direct drilling and stuff by doing that in an organic and a conventional context. Decide who is in charge. Decide whose jobs are what. Build time into this, having a co-design session to look at what's happened and to assess the results and make next step changes. Don't just carry on doing the same trial the second year if it hasn't worked particularly well. And the more we can meet up, events like this, things like we do in Groundswell ORFC meetings, on-farm meetings, events, are a brilliant way of spreading the word, because there's an awful lot of what I call lurkers in our trial groups. You have the farmer who's really engaged. You have another one who's got a bit of a trial plot, but maybe hasn't sort of quite committed. There's an awful lot of people just listening in, following on Twitter, following on the results, picking up on the results we put on our web pages, because that's what, they're the ones who will learn probably more from what's happening, and they will slowly evolve their process. They'll be the ones who scream and shout, I've done it, it's brilliant, I'm wonderful, this is what we're doing. Others you'll suddenly find there's an awful lot of blue-coloured docks growing because they've all bought herbal lay mixes but not told anybody. So, any questions?
Thanks very much, Sherry. Really, really good presentation. I know there's a lot of people in the audience who are doing plenty of farmer-to-farmer research, and I think they'll gain a lot from that. I know if you have questions in the audience, stick up the hand, and there's a Roman mic going around. Jerry, maybe on a lighter note to start off, I used to work in research, and one of the things we were doing was covering plots of wheat with plastic when nitrogen was going out, and sometimes the farmer would forget to pull up the piece of plastic, and you'd have a dead crop underneath, or else they wouldn't put out the plastic. So is there any is there any funny stories from your time going back, or any disasters?
I think the biggest disaster was year one of the trial. One of the first trials we ever did was in a greenhouses, and I think it was on cucumbers. And the farmer, the grower, was really enthusiastic. But he had a team of pickers coming in, and they picked the cucumbers the day before they came in to assess the yields for the trial. So, so a little bit of communication was quite useful on that one.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the sort of things happen. Yeah, equipment being left out in fields, that's sort of not uncommon. You know, find it at harvest. You know,
some of the basics. You had the AHDB and that up there, and like, how often is it that the farmer-to-farmer research translates into those bigger trials and goes on to the likes of the AHDB or NIAB or whoever it is?
The living mulches trial, we're talking with AHDB about them taking it on, because we've got to where we can with our funding streams. I said the live wheat one's going on. Versions of them are carrying on because some of the learnings that the researchers are picking up from it, and they're taking it on in their own research. Yeah. So, and a lot of farmers are carrying on doing it and communicating and working, and there's quite a lot of organisations. The model of IF is the whole idea that farmers can do their own research in the UK has suddenly taken off, and suddenly farmers realise that you've got a big arable farm. Try something different in a corner of the field and see what happens. And they've suddenly realised that they're allowed to. There's always been a feeling that no one's allowed to do it unless you're a trained researcher, but also unless you're a big business. And, you know, we're beginning to understand that regen concepts, agroecology, organic guys are all doing things slightly differently, and it seems to work. So let's try it quietly in the background, not in the field next to that everyone can see, not on the main road, that little one background around the back, the one in behind, the one that you sort of notice. You notice, nobody else does. So it's beginning to happen. Yeah,
that's good, and I think people in the audience will take a lot from that, because it is really important that farmers influence the research that's going on. There's a question in from online there, John R. Do farmers get paid for income forgone in these trials? You know, so if you give up 10 acres of oats, would you give the farmers the base price of what they would have got at market for those oats?
No. No, simple answer to that, no. We work very much on the basis that you're in it for what you can get from it. We appreciate that you're doing your little bit for everybody else. You're working with other farmers. So our model doesn't include funding of losses in that way. If there was an absolute disaster, then we could probably have a conversation. But generally, we're not going to try anything. We're not asking for someone to give up 10 acres of oats. What we would do is a tramline strip down the middle. And I was saying, you know, how many farmers have genuinely turned off the sprayer or not put one of the spray applications on in the conventional sense on one tramline in their field to see what happens if they don't do it? How many people genuinely know what their ideal nitrogen application rate on wheat on their farm is? Not many actually give that a go. So we are talking about a strip. It might be a 20-metre square strip up the field, and that's the only bit that we're doing the trial in. In the worst case scenarios, the glyphosate trial, for example, they were always going to end up spraying with glyphosate anyway at some point. None of them was fully confident that it would work. They were willing to give it a go and were pleasantly surprised that it worked. And they learned a lot by doing so. That's the sort of way we go. Yeah.
I think people who are invested in it as well are, you know, they're not going to be worried about those 10 acres.
I've got
Sean?
Because we're looking at this idea, I was thinking about this. If you didn't go for income forgone, but is there often not income forgone, if you know what I mean? Because I take it the farmers that grow those trials still get to sell, if it's oats or wheat, whatever, from those trials. They still get the crop value.
Absolutely, they still get the crop value.
So it's not like a fungicide trial where you
not on a fungicide. Well, that small bit of the fungicide, if you've saved a bit of fungicide and you've still got the same yields, next year you've saved yourself money anyway, aren't you? So the learning comes from it. We don't do there have been talks about paying a lump sum to the farmer for being involved and stuff like that. It adds to the cost of the trial. And sometimes they're less engaged because they're just going to get the money anyway. You know, and we're trying to work on a shoestring. We started this 10 years ago with limited funds, and that's the model of which we're taking forward. It can be changed. This is our model, but anyone can do what they like to within these models.
Okay, cool. We have a question from the floor there.
Two questions there. First, where can we look at or view the data that's coming from what's done already?
Yep. If you go to our website, innovativefarmers.org. All the trials are on there. At the moment, there is a login requirement, but that's only because the old system, we're updating the website. So innovativefarmers.org, every trial we've ever done, every set of results that we've got is on there, even if it wasn't very good. And I have been criticised by one of the trials, the one on wheat variety trials. I got an irate phone call from an long-term organic farmer saying we shouldn't have put the results up because it made organic farming look bad. And my answer was it was a trial, it was bad. It's not about being organic, it was just disastrous, yeah. So,
and the second question then, is there anywhere that there could be an extension of the concept to catch the comparisons that farmers might have or not, where they've done on-farm comparisons to...
Yes, one of the things we're looking at doing is having much more of a discussion group within this and having the fact that you've done something similar and you can demonstrate your results. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, it's something we're looking at doing. The advantage within the groups when we work is everybody in the group knows that their soil type, their system, whatever, as soon as it goes out into too much and say, I had a 10% increase in yield, and someone will turn around instantly because we know what everyone's like in farming. Yeah, but you've got that drill and you've got this one and I haven't got that drill and you use this chemical. What spray did you use and what's your soil type? And those questions. And we try to go back to a little bit simpler to say, yeah, it worked for you, that's great. Rather than tying yourself too much into that debate of who's, as a phrase I won't use as ladies in the room, but you know, we're not competing, we should be learning from each other. But yes, we want to, knowledge exchange is something we're trying to develop into the process we're doing. Yeah, that's the one thing that we do because it's independent. We're immediately at that point. We've got nothing to gain or lose by what results of these trials. That's the first thing that we have. It doesn't bother us. Unlike some other trials that get done by national organisations, you know, or companies, they'll remove their trial plot from the trial if it doesn't look very good, because they'll skew your results. Everything comes in. So yes, there is a degree. Could we take it further so anyone who tries it gets added to this verified? Possibly. Something to look at.
Do the majority of the trials come from discussion groups that are already formed, or do they are discussion?
Sorry, are most of the trials about yield and profit, or are there also trials about, for example, reducing pollution and runoff?
Everything that we assess within the trial will be relevant to what. So yield, sustainability, resilience, profitability are obviously big drivers for a lot of farmers, but certainly the effect of this change of system on the ecosystem as a whole. Yes, we could in theory be sampling water samples. On some trials we do. We sort of take water samples before and after. We take soil samples before and after. So we look at all those factors as well, because the natural capital value of something is also something that's important within that whole question of farming as a whole. I suppose I'll probably have to talk about yields are the easiest thing to measure, but sometimes social worth is quite useful.
Okay. Sean, I'm going to, you come in there, I have a question for you as well, but put up your hands if you have a question from the floor.
The thorny issue of the researchers is the cost per project looks relatively small, and I know a lot of it is done on goodwill, but how do you manage to pick your researchers? Because I suppose, you know, one of the difficulties I see is that sometimes the research is removed out of the farming scene. So are you getting these guys down in the field to work with those farmers? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we have a pool of researchers that we are aware of. Often when a new field lab comes forward, we'll sort of send round to relevant people and say, do you know someone who has an interest in this field? Often what they will do is, it will be, we don't tend to have postgraduate students doing this. They might be doing the sort of sampling work as part of what they're doing. We wouldn't very rarely have this as a postgrad project because they tend to be much too highbrow. We are definitely working at a lower level. There are organisations like ADAS, AHDB, Organic Research Centre, who do research, and so we would use them as part of it. But what we don't have is And some of our steering committee members are professors at universities, and they will have people in their projects that are useful. So they will often find they overlap into their subject, but what we're not doing is researching their subject for them. We're researching the project for the farmer, asking the researcher to fit into our protocols, because we're more, and the farmer is more important than their PhD. Or their PhD.
And are you finding that there's enough interest from people? Because at that cost, it's
The
you know what I mean?
issue of funding, the issue of cost is part of the problem. Always going to be. We could use more money for. If we had more funding available, we would pay more research money, and it's an ongoing debate about research money in this. But what's key to this is we have a range of different areas, and on some of the projects, the researcher doesn't have to be that clever. You know, I've done 2 of them, simply because what you're doing is taking measurements, doing very straightforward statistical analysis and writing a report. It's not as complex.
And will that be accepted though? Because you know there seems to be a hierarchy.
We're not looking at peer review. We're not expecting our results to be in Nature. We're not looking for peer reviewed work.
So the farmers are the peer reviewers in
the
many ways.
farmers are the peer reviewers, because they're the ones who turn it into something. I don't know how many of you. There is nothing more frustrating than Googling a question and coming up with a research article which you've got to pay to read, and then you read it and realise you've got absolutely no interest in what they were looking at. Because the headline, bit like press, doesn't actually tell the story of what's in the background. So we're not looking for peer-reviewed work. If they want to turn it into peer-reviewed work, it's not impossible. But it's often we're not working at the level that gets to that point. You know, it's not a Nature or it's not a Annals of Soil Science type project.
But it's great.
That will get mentioned, but it's free, but it will get mentioned in those articles, and that's what's fascinating. It pops up as a reference on all these articles, the Innovative Farmers Trial and things like that. So all these researchers are using our information, but it comes to the farmer because it's what the farmer wants to know, not necessarily what the researcher wants to know.
Yeah, and it's great if it does lead to that again.
Yep.
So there's another question there, is there? We'll take just this last question and then we'll finish up. Yeah.
Question there, on the subject of insurance.
Yeah.
If something goes wrong, how is that covered in terms of the farmer or the researcher, or just out of interest?
Yeah. The trials are usually effectively just an adaptation of what the farmer's done normally, so it would probably be covered by their normal insurance. The researchers will have their own personal liability insurance, so we do make sure that farms involved have sort of personal liability insurance on the farm anyway. But what we're not doing, one of the reasons we don't do very many livestock trials is because of the insurance based around actually physical doing stuff to livestock. It's a lot easier on cropping systems because they're just a field. And we're not going to apply anything new or different. So we are working with, you know, I often say some of the projects we do are actually the sort of thing that Grandad used to do. We're just using those practices, using new techniques. So generally on-farm insurance will cover everything that's required.
Yeah. Great. Thanks very much, Jerry.
With one question, just because he has to ask it.
I have to ask it, right.
Sorry. Just a quick one on trials again. Most of the farmers in the room here are doing their own little trial work on the farm. But the trial assistance, you know, approach to farming, let's say conservation ag, there's loads of different, there's 3 main principles, and then there's loads of other things you can add in. How it gets complicated then when you're looking at every different aspect of it. How many parameters would you put into a trial? Like, you look at no-till, cover crops, rotation, and then you add in things like soil testing, then mixing varieties and compost teas. How far would you go to run a trial that it's not too complicated?
The most we would do would probably be 3 different treatments. So tram lines up and down the field, that's the best example. Tram lines up and down the field, and then we cross it with different treatments. But you could do that in terms of you split the field in half Right, so we go up the tram line, we go up the room with the tram lines, and then across the room we'll have 2 different treatments. Well, we could split the 2 different treatments into 2, so you end up with 4 treatments across, because we could take soil tests regularly. We would invariably do soil tests on everything we do, because I think right at the start, everything we do, we've got to look at soil tests all the way through, particularly organic matter assessments are massively important. Just, it's the proxy for soil health. Organic matter and change, that's really significant. We would look at yield, but we would also look at the natural capital effect of what we're doing as well, but no more than 3. Beyond that, you are getting beyond, but don't put 3 on top of each other. 2 on top of each other, if you like. But if you put 3 on, it gets very complex statistically, because how can you prove change that you've made here is down to, is it the first product, is it the second product, or is it the combination of the 2 that's created that change? So don't get too complex. Keep it simple, because the most simple ones will learn it. And next year, maybe drop one of them and do the next thing instead.
Because when you're looking at conservation ag, there's a load of different factors involved in it, and every farmer's doing different practices. So to compare each system.
And the living mulches trial, there were 6 different drills involved. But then that stops being important, because the drill doesn't drive whether living mulches works. Actually, the soil health and the effect of the living mulch drives the result. The drills are the least relevant part of that conversation. I don't tell the machinery manufacturers that's what I've just said, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
You know, that's
keeping
it as simple as you can do. Don't stack too many things, but be aware of the consequences of one on the other.
Yeah. Okay,
Thanks,
we
Erin.
have to cut it
Yeah.
down. So, Jerry, look, thanks a million. Really good. I think
Right.
we've all benefited from it, and thanks so much for coming over as well. So
And
we're
he's-
going to.
I was going to say Jerry's going to be here till tomorrow,
Yeah.
so you can grab him at dinner, at the bar later on. Don't ask him lots of questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please do.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll take a short break now. So we'll be back in 3 minutes with Trevor Harris. So don't go away.